property to be excluded when they go to calculate the federal estate tax. So this isn't something that actually reduces the value of the property. This is a little bonus that the tax code gives the person that put the conservation easement on the property and every successive generation at that next generation's death. Okay, so this is a value that passes down, this credit passes down through the generations. There's lower capital gain tax. If Ken would have sold his property after placing the easement on it, obviously, he's reduced the value of the property, he's going to pay lower capital gains tax. In some situations, there's property tax relief, although generally speaking, with rural land that's in an ag or wildlife valuation, you're not going to change the property tax. However, if we're talking about protecting the value of the property for rollback purposes, that could have a huge impact there. Or if you have property that doesn't have ag, a big property that doesn't have ag, doesn't have wildlife management, a conservation easement will lower the value for appraised purposes as well.
And Thomas, before you came in, I was just telling him that here in Kendall County, as of last week, we finally got the appraiser to come up with a policy for all CEs in Kendall County, and they came up with a nice reduction of our school and county tax.
Wonderful. Wow, that's very, very good. Go ahead, next slide, please. So here's how this valuation issue works. We can't, an appraiser has to come on the property, has to do the market research to determine the impact of the conservation easement on the value, okay? So he comes on the property, looks around, sees what other development's going on, comes in with a value for the property as it's unencumbered. So with no conservation easement, that's the starting point. And then he says, he looks at the restrictions, understands, you know, okay, we've eliminated the right to subdivide here, we've eliminated the ability to build houses here, we've eliminated this or that, maybe restricted mineral interests, all kinds of different things, hunting rights, all kinds of things. And he'll evaluate that and he'll say, okay, under this set of restrictions, the value of this property now has been reduced by X%. And typically, the more valuable the property is for development, i.e. the closer it is to development, the more that reduction, the higher that reduction, okay? So in a piece of property that's close to an urban area, 50 to 90% even. Now I've seen that very rarely. The most I've seen in Texas is 85%, and that's on this property that I'm working on in Hays County right now. It's an 85% reduction in value. That's how restrictive the easement was. Why? Because this was a 2,200 acre ranch, prime for subdivision. They stripped off the development rights. Okay, that's always going to be this big, huge, lovely property from now to eternity, we hope. But in rural areas, now we're talking about 2-3 miles out, or 2-3 hours outside of the city. So remote parts of Texas, you're not going to get a big reduction in value. You'd be lucky to get 25%. Why? Because there's no development pressure. So that's how that kind of works. Land in this area, 50% is not unusual.
So you're near, you can be like 25, 50 miles?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
There's a property that I'm working on right now that's an hour and 15 minutes outside of the San Antonio metro area. Now that's far west, okay, in Uvalde County. And we're looking at a reduction there of 50%, for example. So we're still within that concentric circle of development. Go ahead, Brett. Let's look at a case study, 600-acre Ray's Ranch. He bought it in 1975, paid $300,000 for it, $500 an acre. And he, at that time, looked at the property, and to him, the most valuable part of the property was the open space. He wanted to have a few cows and recreate on the property. Okay, go ahead. However, in 2009, the same 600 acres, the value went up to $12,000. Now this is not a very expensive piece of property in the hill country. I mean, values, this, you know, maybe this, I don't know where this property might have been located, but I've seen easily $18,000 per acre in the hill country. So this is pretty modest. His $300,000 property, the 600 acres, went up to over $7 million. Why? Because the value of the property was its potential for development. Go ahead, one more. So let's look at how this income tax savings actually works. And you can do this on the back of a napkin, all right, if you need to. because the formula is very simple. What you have to know, so if you're thinking about your own property, what you have to know, your own situation is, what is your adjusted gross income on your tax return? So if you file a 1040, it's on the bottom of page 1, I think it's line 38 or 39, that's your AGI, your adjusted gross income for the year. You have to know that number, all right? In this case, Ray was a physician, he had a $500,000 annual income, okay? He was still working. This 600 acres was his recreation property. He's in a 35% tax bracket. So he's got to pay 35% of that $500,000 to Uncle Sam every year. He puts a conservation easement on this property that represents 70% of its market value. So it's $5 million. That's the value of the easement. So an appraiser came out, looked at the property, looked at where it was located, looked at the restrictions and says, wow, you're really placing a great set of restrictions on this property. We're going to shrink the value of this property by 70%, okay? So now we get into the little part of the formula. Once you know those basic facts. Under the tax code, you are limited to the amount that you can use of that deduction every year, okay? So Ray's got this big deduction, a $5 million deduction that he reports on his income tax return. But he can't take that in year one. He doesn't have enough income, first of all. He doesn't have $5 million worth of income. He's limited to, under the current law, 50% of his AGI. Okay? So what can he do? He can take $250,000 of this deduction in year one, in 2009. And he can carry that deduction forward for a total of 16 years. So year one, the year that he makes the gift, plus 15 years. So he can realize annually over $87,000 in tax savings. This is money that he does not have to pay the federal government. And you add that up over the course of this period of time, he can use a total of $1.4 million. So that's how this works. So what you're doing is you're taking the development potential that you don't want to use anyway, and you're turning it into a cash machine in a sense, under the tax code that allows you to take this deduction and realize these tax savings.
And this is only if it's gifted, not if the easement's bought.
Well, right, if somebody's paying you dollar for dollar, if somebody paid him $5 million, there'd be no deduction. He'd have the $5 million. If somebody paid him $2 million, he'd have a $3 million deduction. If he used that, he could offset the capital gain he'd have to pay on the $2 million with part of this deduction as well. And that's a very good question. Thank you very much for that. We'll move on to the next slide. Hit it again. Okay. Unfortunately, the tax code is a creature of federal government. They tinker with it all the bloody time. They changed the rules in 2006 to support conservation. They provided a set of incentives to create more tax benefit. Those are the rules that are currently in place. The example that I just showed you was under those rules. Those rules are set to expire at the end of this year. Now, we don't know what the future holds because there's a lot of foment on Capitol Hill right now. As you can well imagine, people are trying to politic their way into all kinds of changes. Federal state tax is going to be changing. All of these tax incentives are on the line. There's tremendous bipartisan support to continue the incentives, even to make them permanent. So there's a possibility that they will continue. Even if it doesn't happen before December 31st, it could still happen later in the spring and be retroactive. But we won't know that at the time, okay? So everyone's wondering what's going to happen. Well, what's going to happen is the old law is going to come back to the fore. It's going to be in effect unless these incentives are made permanent. And under the old law, instead of a 50% adjusted gross income, you're limited to 30% of your adjusted gross income. So look and see how these same facts create a different outcome here. Instead of 16 years carrying forward, it's a total of 6.
Why would the old law come in?
Because it's almost like the way they did this is they passed it to sunset at the end of a certain period of time. And the reason is because they were looking to see the economic impact of doing this.
So it's like a
incentive.
trial.
Right.
See what this